Hello, today we are going to be discussing Søren Kierkegaard, a very powerful, eccentric thinker who really wasn't acknowledged on the world scene until the 30s and 40s when the existentialists claimed him as a kind of forefather. He was born in 1813 and died in 1815. He basically lived his life in Copenhagen in Denmark, except for a brief time in Berlin where he went to hear the lectures of Schelling, who was invited by the Prussian king to, as he said, stamp out the dragon seed of Hegelian pantheism. So he did go to Berlin and listen to the lectures of Schelling. He, in the end, wasn't too impressed, but this animus against Hegel is something that motivates much of Kierkegaard's thought. So again, we're going to be dealing with Hegel and the aftermath of Hegel here. But what makes Kierkegaard such a singular figure is that his question really was, how does one become a Christian? And that's not a question you would expect a major figure in the history of philosophy to be asking, and certainly not one after the 1700s after the Enlightenment to be asking. But he was a deeply committed Christian. And his work was geared toward trying to make the Christians of his time take seriously the demands of becoming a Christian. Because, in fact, even though we think of the 19th century as the age of ideology and as being a secular time, that didn't happen until the later decades of the century. During Kierkegaard's time, everybody was still Christian. The Enlightenment did not do away with Christianity on the continent, certainly not in Germany. So Kierkegaard didn't face a world of atheists or post-Christians. He was looking at a group of Christians who were convinced that they were very Christian, and he saw something that was dead, that wasn't vitally Christian. But even beneath that question of how does one become a Christian, he really was addressing how does one become human. His concern was for inwardness, for existence, for taking an interest in one's own life and being deliberate about how to live it. And so he is existentialist. He's having us ask ourselves, what form of life should we live? And indeed, how should we live? It is Kierkegaard's question. It really does motivate him. He had a method of indirect communication. In much of his writing, he's writing under pseudonyms. And he's not giving a discourse for us to weigh arguments. Should I buy this line of reasoning or not? He's presenting in an artistic way different ways of life, and he wants us then to see that way of life from the inside and to either say, "I'm going to choose this," or "I'm going to choose this other way of life." And he's addressing us individually. He didn't want to build a grand system that applied to everyone abstractly. He was writing to that single individual, der Einzelne, that single individual. His audience wasn't meant to be humanity, it was meant to be you. And I have found this in my own life. My memory isn't failing me, the first philosophical work after Plato's Republic that I read and that deeply influenced me was the first volume of Either Or, which is one of his very important works, where he's starting to lay out this basic system of ways of life into where he divides it into aesthetic, ethical, and religious. But before we get to that, I want to finish out a description of his life. After writing an immense amount of amazing material in the early 40s, he got caught up in this controversy with a publication called The Corsair, which was a kind of a gossipy journalism. And he was taking a stand against that. And what that did was bring down the wrath of that journal, that newspaper upon him. And so he became very ridiculed in this really in the end, a small city. And that only reinforced his sense that mass opinion was not a good way for humanity to develop. And at the end of his life, he would engage in an attack on what he called Christendom, It is an attack on the established Lutheran Church of Denmark. He felt that was necessary in order to advance this project of becoming a Christian. Catholics in particular are used to this phrase, grace perfects nature. That's associated with Thomas Aquinas and the scholastic view that in fact there is this kind of seamless whole of reality, even if you have a supernatural God and you have supernatural events like the incarnation and the redemption. In the end, everything that happens in the world of grace, it seamlessly dovetails with nature. If you take, as some people have called Hegel, the Protestant Aquinas, one can see that, in fact, his system does another representation of a seamless whole, right? Where reason is being realized in all of the vagaries of history. In my life, in your life, there's one idea working itself out, the idea of freedom. And so one could say, so there's that seamless whole again. Kierkegaard does not buy this. And now he's not attacking the scholastic view directly, but it does apply. But he's attacking the Hegelian form and saying, life isn't seamless. It's jagged. And there are ways of life, they don't lead, one form of life doesn't lead by a dialectical necessity into another form of life. You're standing before different ways of life, and you sometimes have to just choose. You just have to take a leap. That leap image may have had something to do with this thinker Lessing, who had, in his own turn, had an effect on Hegel's view of himself as a cultural pedagogue. Lessing talked about the broad, ugly ditch between the facts of history and any claim for supernatural revelation. That is, even if, Lessing said, even if I granted that I knew that Jesus Christ walked the earth and these events happened, even that he was crucified, how could I get from those historical events to affirming that there's a Trinity, for instance? He called it, there's this ditch. And in a way, Kierkegaard is saying you've got to leap. You've got to go from one to the other. Now, there are forms of Christianity that would say you can actually, there's ways to think across that ditch. But Kierkegaard doesn't have that view. Before talking about the different ways of life, again, he's looking at a situation where everybody's still basically Christian, but it's a bourgeois Christianity. It's a rationalist Christianity. It's a Christianity where Kant's version of rational religion has really won the day, or Hegel's version of rational religion has won the day. And let's remind ourselves what that means. For Kant, one cannot know anything about the existence of God or the immortality of the soul or the system of the world as a whole. All one can do is, based on the fact that we are free and we are moral beings, he works backwards from our sense of morality, that in fact there are moral laws that they hold and that in fact we legislate. We can work backwards from that as postulates of practical reason and say, God must exist because the highest good must in fact match happiness with moral desert. There must be freedom because we couldn't have desert without freedom. There must be immortality because we couldn't ever become perfected as moral agents unless we had the condition of immortality, and so on. So he proves some of these doctrines of the faith as postulates of practical reason. They're not things that he says we can affirm theoretically, but we can affirm them because we know that they back up our morality. So this is the shift from a Christianity that was dogmatic and that believed in supernatural events like miracles to a Christianity that is a function of morality, that is taking Jesus as a moral teacher and maybe the greatest moral teacher, and this is what we call liberal Christianity. That's not a term, a program, it's a term in the history of theology. So that liberal Christianity, bourgeois Christianity, rationalist Christianity, that's the Christianity of Europe before Christianity collapsed, right, in the latter part of the century. Kierkegaard saw that Christianity and said, that's not Christian. That what does that have to do with the beliefs of this religion? And so what he wanted us to see is that there are different ways of existing in the world that are not related in a dialectically smooth way. The basic divisions are aesthetic, ethical, and religious. That book, Either Or, deals with the aesthetic and the ethical in particular. And then this remarkable little book called Fear and Trembling deals with the ethical and religious together. The aesthetic is a way of life, and that first volume of Either Or are these papers of an aesthete. It's famously includes the Diary of a Seducer, which is it's a powerful piece of writing, where a man worms his way into a woman's life just to get her to fall in love with him, and then he leaves. That reminds me. A lot of his writing is playing off of the trauma of his. I have to say this because he broke off an engagement with a woman named Regina Olsen, and he felt as if his vocation as a writer was not compatible with married life. He also felt as if his melancholy disposition would have ruined Regina's life for whatever reason, and his reasons shifted. That broken engagement in 1841, it determined the rest of his life, and he's drawing off that pain and throughout his writing career. In the Diary of a Seducer, he's presenting himself in a certain way, but the point is that the seducer, the aesthete, does this project because he finds it interesting. So the aesthetic way of life is a way of being in the world where these possibilities are there, and I'm enjoying the possibilities. The ethical way of life, and this is the response in volume 2 at Either Or, is you don't want to live that life because you're completely at the whim of circumstance. That if you have an enjoyable life depends on all kinds of contingencies. If you live the ethical way of life, then you've got a role to play in society, and you fulfill that role, and that's going to lead to some kind of happiness. That ethical way of life looks Kantian maybe at first, but it really is the Hegelian way of being ethical. That is, you're embedded in a communal sense of what it means to do the right thing. Kierkegaard dismantles this, or he shows the limitations of the ethical way of life in Fear and Trembling, where he takes the story of the binding of Isaac, God's calling Abraham to sacrifice his son on Mount Moriah. And what he does brilliantly in this book is try to think in the mind of Abraham, what could this be like? What could this thought be like? He dealt with the problematic that you could hear Christian preachers take the story and praise Abraham, but if you were in your own life to do something that was against convention or against moral norms, right now, that same preacher who just eulogized Abraham would say, you're a fiend. And Kierkegaard thinks, well, I need us to think this more thoroughly, right? What is happening with the binding of Isaac? And in the end, he has this fancy word, the teleological suspension of the ethical, that God presides over a world where straight moral norms, though they may be true, there's more to the story. And that jaggedness to reality is what Kierkegaard wants to always point us to. And I think it's something we can verify in our own lives, that there's all kinds of rules that make sense, but life has a way of frustrating the intelligibility of those rules or the realization of those rules. And so he talks about a leap of faith, that in fact, to become a religious knight of faith, that is what he calls Abraham, a knight of faith, you can't make sure of yourself. You have to take a leap into the dark. You have to believe. You have to trust. Now, there's a certain tradition in Catholicism, especially, that says that's fideism. That is, it's a way of denying reason and giving us a faith that has nothing to do with reason. And it's true that insofar as Kierkegaard is trying to reject Hegelian reason and that imperialist way of subsuming all of reality under reason. But we do need to ask, does that hit even the scholastic view? Is the reality that we live in a rational whole? Or are in fact there deep fissures and chasms that we have to negotiate? In any case, Kierkegaard is not someone one can assess from the outside. One has to experience the reading, and hopefully that when you step into that world, you will find yourself, as I have found myself, to be deeply challenged and deeply moved by this very beautiful thinker.